Would you believe if a place that burned down 4 decades ago still made emergency calls? At Yellowstone National Park, night dispatcher Evelyn Monroe has been receiving strange distress calls from a long-abandoned cabin, calls from a woman whispering in terror, "Please, I'm trapped down here." The problem: the cabin was destroyed by a wildfire in 1982. Nothing remains, no structure, no debris, not even a foundation. And yet, when park rangers arrived on the 4th night to investigate, they heard the same voice, muffled, distant, calling out from beneath the earth. Content warning. This story belongs to the realm of true horror stories and dives deep into creepy park ranger stories, wilderness stories, and scary true stories that defy logic. Listen carefully. This is not a tale, it's a transmission. Evelyn Monroe was no stranger to strange reports. In her 15 years working at the Yellowstone National Park Emergency Dispatch Center, she had heard every kind of emergency call: lost hikers, mountain lion sightings, even the occasional desperate hoaxer. But this was something else entirely. The first call came at 3:09 a.m. It was brief, static. Then, "Help me, it's burning. I can't get out." The GPS ping placed the origin at Cabin 12, deep in a restricted area of the parkland scorched by wildfire in 1982. No structure had existed there for over 40 years. She chalked it up to a glitch, until the second night, then the third. By the 5th call, she couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just creepy, it was consistent. Same voice, same time, same message. She logged the call under possible interference. But in the back of her mind, Evelyn knew she had stumbled onto something that didn't belong in any wilderness story. This was the start of a true scary story, one that didn't make sense. Rangers Paul Greaves and Isabella Tran were dispatched to the coordinates. Both seasoned with years of park ranger stories between them, they were skeptical. But as the ATV crawled over the ash-swept clearing of what used to be Cabin 12, a strange chill clung to the air despite the summer night. "No way there's anything here," Paul muttered, scanning the area with a flashlight. Then they heard it, a soft knock, 3 times. From the ground beneath their boots, they froze. "Could be a coyote in a burrow," Isabella offered, voice shaky. But Paul stepped closer and knelt down. The ground felt hollow, not loose dirt, something beneath, something that echoed. That night, they reported their findings. Evelyn logged it, and in her report, for the first time in her career, she typed the word "unexplained." The calls grew more detailed. "It's Lucy. They said I'd be safe here, but they lied. It burns. Every night it burns again." One night, Evelyn received a different call, a man's voice, calm, collected. "She's not supposed to talk. You've heard too much. Hang up." Then silence. These weren't just creepy stories anymore. This was a warning. She sent everything to her supervisor, who dismissed it as an elaborate prank. But Evelyn wasn't done. She went to Reddit, to the subreddits known for true horror stories. Let's Not Meet Creepy Outdoor Stories, and what she found chilled her. Multiple threads dating back years, all titled some variation of "The Girl in the Ground, Cabin 12 Signal, Help Me, It's Burning." The same voice, the same message, from different states, different parks, all referencing abandoned ranger stations, burned areas, cabins destroyed by wildfires long ago. Paul and Isabella returned to the site, this time with GPR ground-penetrating radar. At 4 feet deep, they found a cavity, 6 feet wide, 10 feet long. An unregistered structure, a forgotten cellar. They dug carefully. At 7 feet, they hit wood rotted, scorched. A door. When they pried it open, an old rusted ladder led into darkness. They radioed Evelyn. "We found something. This isn't a normal park ranger story. Ev, we're going in." The descent was slow, the air damp and metallic. The basement was small, stone-lined, But something was off. There were scratches on the walls, fingernail deep, chains bolted into concrete. A girl's name was carved over and over, Lucy, Lucy, Lucy. And in the corner, a burned doll fused to the wall. Isabella turned pale. This wasn't just a cabin, this was a prison. After their discovery, the park received a surprise visit from agents of the U.S. Forest Service, accompanied by a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Dalton. He demanded access to the records, confiscated the GPR equipment, and sealed off the site under hazardous contamination protocol. Evelyn was ordered to forget everything. So were the Rangers, but they couldn't. Paul left his job a week later. Vanished. No resignation. Isabella refused to speak. Evelyn, she stayed, because the calls never stopped. Now they were coming at different times. Sometimes 1:17 a.m., sometimes noon. Voices she didn't recognize. A child sobbing, a man praying. One night, her headset buzzed with feedback, and then, you found her. But she's not the only one. There are more, and you're next. She quit the next morning. 6 months later, Evelyn received a package, no return address. Inside a charred cassette labeled Cabin 12, Final. She played it, static, then Lucy's voice. If you're hearing this, I'm gone. But the ground remembers. It always remembers. They built over us, they lied, they never stopped. Then, the growl, that low, inhuman voice, she told. Now you will too. The recording ends with heavy breathing, and then Evelyn hears her own name, not spoken, but whispered, from inside her house. Evelyn couldn't sleep. Even after quitting her post, even after trying to disappear into a normal job at a library in Missoula, Montana, the static still haunted her dreams. There was something about Cabin 12 that refused to let go. She kept hearing Lucy's voice not through a headset, but in the low hum of the refrigerator at night, in the creak of the hallway wood, even in the gentle rustle of trees when the wind passed. She joined forums online, communities filled with true scary stories, the kind Reddit users whispered about at 3 a.m. And what she discovered only made things worse. Across subreddits like Let's Not Meet Creepy Park Ranger Stories and Stories from Reddit, there were threads going back decades. All of them hinted at the same thing: unexplained voices, eerie signals in the wilderness, missing persons in national parks, and park rangers who went silent after reporting something they shouldn't have seen. One post stood out. I was a wilderness guide in Glacier National Park, 2002. Heard a child's voice in the middle of the night asking for help. No kids in the area, just a burnt tree stump where the sound came from. Still have nightmares. Another one read, former ranger. Worked Grand Teton back in the 90s. Found an old cellar beneath a forest cabin. It wasn't on any map. My partner vanished the next week. Evelyn bookmarked every story, highlighted the dates and locations. The threads wove a horrifying pattern, as if every true creepy story connected to something deeper, a hidden truth buried beneath America's wilderness stories. The forest, she realized, was a graveyard of secrets, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. A package. Again, no return address. But this time it was a vintage National Park Service ranger badge, burnt at the edges, and a folded map. The map was old, older than anything she had seen during her dispatch years. And on it, drawn in red ink, were 7 locations circled throughout the Rocky Mountains. Cabins, all long gone, all tied to fire, on the back in handwriting that trembled with urgency. She's not the only one. Listen again. Evelyn's hands shook as she plugged in the cassette player and re-listened to the final tape. But this time she played it in reverse. The static morphed into whispers, then a name, Clark, and then coordinates. She didn't hesitate. She rented a car and drove north. The woods near Flathead National Forest were eerily quiet. It was the off-season and snowfall had blanketed the hiking trails, leaving no sign of footprints. Evelyn parked, checked the coordinates and hiked. It took her 3 hours to reach the marked point. Just as the sun began to dip, she saw it, an old ranger tower, half collapsed, its windows shattered like jagged teeth. Faint smoke curled from a rusted chimney. And yet, no one was supposed to be here. She climbed the steps, each creak echoing into the trees. The door swung open with a shriek. Inside the room was empty. Dust, cobwebs, a table, a radio. She approached it. The knobs were brittle, but the radio was still connected to a power cell, somehow still alive. She turned the dial. Static, more static, and then Evelyn. She froze. Clark didn't listen either. It was a child's voice. Then another whisper layered over it, deeper, older, distorted. The fire cleanses, but the ground remembers. She turned off the radio, ran. But when she reached the forest edge, something had changed. The snow no longer showed her own tracks. The sky above was starless, and the forest no longer looked like Montana. It looked older, rotten, as if she had stepped into one of those creepy outdoors stories told by rangers too afraid to file an official report. Back at the ranger tower, a figure watched through broken glass. Not quite human, not quite anything. It wore the old green of a park ranger uniform, faded and charred. Its eyes were hollow, filled with ash. When Evelyn returned to her car, it was gone. Only a cassette sat in its place. She played it as she drove. Lucy again. We tried to tell you, you're on their land now. The land doesn't forget. The transmission ended with the sound of wood burning, but her rear-view mirror reflected a figure standing in the middle of the road. She didn't stop. The days that followed blurred. She tried to report the incident, but no one believed her. The Park Service said the tower didn't exist. No map had ever marked such a place. No one named Clark had worked the region in 40 years. She returned to Reddit, the only place where true horror stories felt more honest than the official line. She found a user, Old Tower Truth. They sent her one message: check under your floorboards. She did. There, wrapped in plastic, was another ranger badge, burned, and behind it, a photo of Evelyn from the night before, sleeping. A shadow stood in the corner of the image, a silhouette in a ranger uniform. It hadn't ended. It never ended. One night, Evelyn heard the call again, on a public AM frequency. Cabin 12 is burning. Cabin 12 is burning. This time, the voice wasn't Lucy's. It was her own, begging, crying, trapped. And suddenly she realized she had become part of the story. One of the scary horror stories no one would believe. Evelyn Monroe hadn't left her apartment in 4 days. Each night the whispers grew louder, not from her phone or the broken cassette, but from inside her walls. Her name, sometimes spoken in Lucy's voice, sometimes deeper. Something was trying to come through, something that remembered her. She tried reporting everything to the National Park Service again. This is a prank, ma'am, they said. Cabin 12 doesn't exist. No one's used that call frequency since the 80s. But she knew they were lying, or worse, hiding. Because 2 nights ago she got a knock on her door. Not her apartment door, her bedroom door. She lived alone. And when she opened it, no one was there, just muddy footprints on the carpet leading out the window. It was then she knew she had to go back. She returned to the woods near Glacier National Park this time, with a police-grade field recorder and satellite communicator. Evelyn was prepared, at least she thought she was. What she wasn't prepared for was what she found in the snow: a single ranger boot, burnt, and beside it a name tag, Clark. She remembered that name from the whisper on the tape. Clark was real, and Clark was missing. The radio tower was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed. Gone. In its place, an open clearing, freshly burned, too recent for satellite imaging. But the ground, still warm, still humming. She knelt and pressed her ear to the soil. A sound, not voices, a heartbeat, a slow rhythmic thumping from below. She dropped the recorder and ran. Back in town, Evelyn spent the night at a small motel near Kalispell. She barely slept, but as she tried to drift off, the radio in the room crackled to life, an old analog dial model she'd never touched. Static, then a voice. "You shouldn't have come back, Evelyn. Now you'll hear them all." The static changed pitch, turned into screaming, not just one voice, dozens, hundreds, children, men, rangers, people begging for help. And over it all, footsteps thudding on the motel ceiling, heavy boots pacing directly above. But her room was on the top floor. She checked out the next morning without a word, drove west, no destination, just away. But the radio in her car switched frequencies on its own, again and again. And every station, every single one, was broadcasting the same thing. Cabin 12 is burning. The ranger lied. She opened the ground. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't a message, it was a curse. At a gas station outside Spokane, she stopped for coffee. The cashier looked up startled. "You were on the radio," he said. "What, last night?" "AM 1470. You were crying, asking for help, saying they buried you alive." Evelyn froze. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She hadn't made a call. But when she asked to see the recording, the cashier hesitated. "Thing is, ma'am, your voice wasn't coming from the speakers." He tapped his temple. "It was coming from up here." Then he handed her something he said was left for her. A cassette, black, burned around the edges. Back in her car, she played it. Not through a tape deck, it wouldn't fit. But the cassette started playing anyway, from the speakers, from the air itself. "You are marked now, Evelyn. Every ranger knows your name. They remember the fire." Then a sound like dragging chains, like something enormous moving through the dirt. Then silence. She pulled over and vomited. Something was in the ground, something old, something patient. Evelyn didn't go home. Home wasn't safe anymore. In fact, she wasn't sure anywhere was. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the map again, the one she'd received weeks ago with the burned badge and red circles. Every one of those cabins was marked with fire, and now, so was her name. What connected them? That night she stopped at a dusty library in a town too small to remember. In the archives, tucked behind faded National Park ranger logs, she found a restricted file, Clark Jr., Incident Report 12. The folder contained exactly one thing, a transcript of a radio transmission dated July 17th, 1982. Ranger Clark, 1:37 a.m. "There's a woman. She says her name is Lucy, claims she's under the cabin. There is no basement. 1:41 a.m. I keep hearing scratching, not from inside, from below. 1:45 a.m. I see her face in the mirror, but she's not here. I know she's dead. 1:50 a.m. The fire's starting again. I didn't light anything. 2:03 a.m. Unintelligible. It's in the ground. It remembers us all. Then silence. The final line was handwritten. Clark never returned. Cabin 12 was declared unsalvageable. Evelyn drove to the last red circle on the map. It wasn't a cabin. It was a ranger station, abandoned, half swallowed by forest. The sign barely visible. Echo Ridge Fire Lookout. The wind shifted. Whispers, not from the trees, from below. She stepped inside. Ash coated everything. Char marks on the ceiling. The air was dry, acrid. Something had burned here long ago and stayed burning. She found a staircase leading down beneath a trap door. That made no sense. Ranger stations didn't have basements, yet there it was. She descended. The basement was a concrete hallway, narrow, stretching impossibly far. Along the walls, name tags, all burned, all familiar. J. Clark L. Matheson R. Barrick Evelyn stopped. The last tag was hers, E. Monroe, and under it, scrawled in charcoal, If you're reading this, it's already too late." She turned around, but the door was gone. Only the hallway remained, and it was getting warmer. She ran, but the hallway kept changing. Doors appeared, opened, revealed things she couldn't process. Flashes of true scary stories she'd only read about online. A ranger shack buried in snow with bloody handprints leading inside. A child in a Smokey the Bear hat mouth, sewn shut, staring from a window. A fire tower upside down, suspended in the sky. She stumbled, fell to her knees. Behind her, heavy footsteps, ranger boots. She dared not look. A door opened on its own. Inside a cassette player, it was already playing. You're listening to Wild 217 AM, where the forest speaks back, her voice crying, "Please, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have come here." Then silence, then Clark's voice. "They made me part of the story. Now I can't leave." And then Lucy's, "Tell them, Evelyn, or they'll dig up more." The tape ended with screaming. Evelyn stood trembling. The hallway had shifted again. This time, a ladder leading up. She climbed. Each rung burned her palms. The air grew colder, and when she emerged, it wasn't into daylight. It was into fog. A massive clearing. Dozens of cabins surrounded her, all burning silently. None made a sound. Flames danced in reverse smoke, rising into the ground instead of the sky, and all around her rangers, uniformed, hollow-eyed. They didn't move. They just stared. One stepped forward, handed her a radio. "Your shift starts now," then vanished. The radio crackled, a voice she didn't recognize. "Welcome to the story, Evelyn. You're not the first, but maybe you'll be the last." Evelyn didn't know how long she stood in the clearing. Time was broken here. The burning cabins didn't crumble. The flames didn't consume. Everything remained suspended like a cursed memory, on loop. The forest whispered names, dates, frequencies. She reached for the radio the hollow-eyed ranger gave her. It was an older model, cracked and smeared with ash. A single dial blinked 1470 AM, the same frequency as the distress calls. She turned it on, static, then a voice clear and sharp. Cabin 12 never burned. It was buried, and it breathes. A sound followed, low, rhythmic, like lungs inhaling. The earth beneath her pulsed. Then the frequency changed on its own. One word repeated over and over, "Run." Evelyn ran. Through the burning cabins, through warped trees with trunks shaped like screaming faces, through a mist that thickened as she moved. At the center of the clearing stood a mound. Half-buried wood beams, the skeletal remains of a roof, a shattered lantern embedded in ash. Cabin 12. She knew it before she reached it. She fell to her knees and began digging. Hands bloodied, nails cracked. The dirt was warm, sticky, like something beneath it still lived. Then she found it, a trapdoor, blackened, locked from the outside, and from underneath it a knock. 3 times. She hesitated, then opened it. A narrow shaft dropped into pitch darkness. She climbed down. The ladder seemed endless. Her flashlight flickered, died. Still, she descended, guided only by instinct, by memory, by voices, and then a light. She dropped into a room. No, a listening post. Old technology everywhere. Cassette decks, reel-to-reel machines, microphones suspended in midair. And in the center, a massive circular console with a symbol burned into it. A tree, upside down, roots exposed. A woman stood at the far end, hair matted, uniform tattered, pale skin stretched too tight. It was Lucy, but not the girl from the stories. Older, twisted by time, or by the forest. "You shouldn't have come," Lucy whispered. "They'll make you record now." She pointed to a chair, strapped with wires, tubes, a microphone aimed at the throat. Evelyn backed away. "No, they need stories," Lucy said. "They are the stories." Behind Lucy, a wall opened, a tunnel. Dozens of other rangers stood in it, staring. And one by one, they began speaking. "I was buried in Big Bend. I burned in Glacier. I screamed in Yosemite. Every national park had a name. Every ranger had a voice. They weren't ghosts. They were recordings looped, fed back into the radios, played into the minds of unsuspecting hikers. "You heard us," Evelyn Lucy said, "and now you're one of us." The room shook. Dust fell. The ceiling cracked. Above ground, the cabin burned again, flames in reverse. Time resetting. Evelyn turned to flee, but her foot snagged a cable. She fell. The microphone dropped beside her. Still recording. 1470 AM, it whispered. "We're still here. Tell them." When they found the cabin again months later, it was buried beneath a landslide. No trace of Evelyn, only a cassette player, still spinning, broadcasting static, and beneath it, a new name carved into wood: E. Monroe, Ranger. Some say you can still hear her voice, late at night, on old Forest Service radios. She doesn't scream anymore. She warns, don't answer the call, don't dig, don't listen. Evelyn had survived, but survived was a relative word now. After her escape, or whatever she could call clawing her way out of an impossible underground tunnel, the forest had changed. She had changed. And above all else, the radio frequency was still open. Back in town, her voice trembled as she tried to explain it to the authorities. The cabin, she whispered, "It's alive." They didn't believe her. No one did. Not the park services, not the other rangers, not even her former colleague Jackson, who'd once admitted to hearing the static-filled distress calls from beneath the woods. But something strange happened a week later. The broadcast moved. At precisely 17 a.m., a jogger reported hearing screaming voices from his portable wilderness radio coming from the middle of Yellowstone's Echo Ridge, near a trail long since closed after the 1982 wildfires. He said the voices kept repeating. She opened the gate. "We're coming through." The next day, the jogger vanished. Only his radio remained, still playing that same phrase, "We're coming through." And that's when Evelyn realized something horrifying. The broadcast was spreading, not just in Echo Ridge, but across multiple national parks. She saw reports online, Reddit threads, "Let's not meet" confessions, creepy park ranger stories shared by strangers. I was camping in Yosemite, heard a voice whispering under my tent, stayed overnight at a fire tower in Oregon, woke up to footsteps under the floorboards. I work trails in Acadia. Sometimes the radios pick up crying. No one's on the line. These weren't isolated incidents. They were echoes. Something was bleeding through. Evelyn returned to where it all began. Not the cabin, not the trapdoor, but the ranger station itself, now sealed, condemned, surrounded by warning signs that meant nothing to her anymore. She broke in at midnight. Inside, everything had been cleaned up. The tapes gone, the maps erased, the files scrubbed, but she knew where to look. Beneath the floorboards of the back office, in a space no wider than a crawl space, she found what she feared, a fresh reel-to-reel recorder, still warm, still spinning. She listened. It played her voice from 3 days ago. "This is Evelyn Monroe, former dispatcher. If you're hearing this, don't follow my steps. Don't dig. Don't listen. They're not stories anymore. They're real. They're learning to speak on their own now. The tape cut out, but the machine didn't stop." A second voice began. One Evelyn had never heard before. Masculine, cold. She opened the first gate. 2 more remain. Each one needs a witness. Then silence. Then a burst of static so loud she ripped off the headphones, bleeding from one ear. As she scrambled out of the crawl space, something occurred to her, something she hadn't dared to accept. The voices weren't trapped. They were waiting for someone to listen, waiting for witnesses, and every time someone tuned in, they got stronger. That night, Evelyn did something reckless. She turned the frequency public, posted everything to Reddit, uploaded the tapes, submitted the logs to a podcast called Let's Read. shared her story with every forum that archived true, creepy stories and wilderness horror. And that's when she got the first email, Subject Echo Ridge, don't talk about it. They've already found your voice. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She watched the forums light up with comments, people from all over the US claiming to hear similar strange radio transmissions on their camping trips, hikes, or fire tower shifts. I'm in Glacier heard the broadcast too. 1470 AM. Creepy as hell. Yo, this reminds me of one of those scary Reddit stories, but it's real. This is real. Someone's broadcasting from inside the Appalachian Trail. I'm serious, I was on the ridge. It wasn't a prank. Evelyn sat frozen. Her story had spread far beyond Echo Ridge. But what no one realized, what she hadn't dared admit, even to herself, was that the broadcast wasn't just a signal anymore. It was an invitation. 3 nights later, her phone rang. No number, just a timestamp. 7:10 a.m., she answered. Only static. Then a low, grinding whisper. Gate 2, open. She dropped the phone. It was happening. Again. Evelyn didn't know what Gate 2 was, but she knew where the signal had gone next Zion National Park. She booked a flight. Zion wasn't like Echo Ridge. The cliffs were sharp, the colors surreal, and the canyon walls echoed everything, including voices, not your own. She arrived under the guise of a forest researcher, but locals already knew who she was. They whispered. One older man at the outpost said the last ranger to go missing left behind his boots, but no feet in them. Another said, you think the caves are deep? Try the silence in them. And then a ranger named Travis pulled her aside. We got a report last week, he said. Someone heard screaming from under Angel's Landing. No one's been able to hike there since, not without going mad. That night, Evelyn went alone, up the narrow trail, past warning signs, into the fog. At 2:17 a.m., her radio buzzed. She hadn't turned it on. We're almost through. Come below. She paused near a ledge. A shadow passed overhead, no wings, no shape, just absence. The air grew cold. The ground cracked. She heard it again knocking, not from the cliffs, from inside them. She pressed her palm to the stone. Heat pulsed, like a heartbeat. Then a crack opened, small but real, a pathway into the stone. Evelyn stepped inside. The tunnel descended in spirals, deeper than geology allowed. Each turn showed new carvings on the wall, symbols, dates, old ranger badges embedded in rock like insects in amber. Then bones, old, scorched, and in the center, a chair with headphones and a microphone, already on. A voice spoke from the dark, not hers, not human. You tell the stories, but the stories use you now. Evelyn froze. There in front of her was another tape deck. This one bore her initials. You're the second gate, the voice said. The third waits in the fire. Then the tunnel shook. The voice screamed. Evelyn ran. She emerged into the light at dawn. The crack sealed behind her, and her radio was gone. But her voice still played on someone else's device. A hiker passed by holding an emergency beacon. Strange, he said. Just picked up this weird signal. Sounds like... You, Evelyn, didn't answer, because now she understood. The broadcast had detached from its source. It had become viral. It traveled by signal, by retelling, by belief. Her face appeared in a story thread on Reddit the next day, title Wilderness Story. Woman in Zion Canyons warns of gates. She didn't post it, but someone had. And the top comment read, I heard it too. In the woods behind my house, in Maine. The third gate was opening, and this time there would be no more warnings. Only signal, only static, only the voices beneath. Evelyn knew the third gate had opened the moment she saw the fire. Not in the forest, but in the radio broadcast itself. She tuned into 1470 AM at exactly 2:17 AM again. Not by choice. This time it turned on by itself. The voice came through clearer than ever. You are the fire. You are the frequency. And then something impossible. She heard herself breathing on the radio live, but she wasn't speaking. Someone or something was mimicking her voice, broadcasting it from somewhere beneath the ground. It laughed, then repeated a single phrase: broadcast received, and every radio in her apartment turned on at once. The next morning, the news hit multiple hikers lost in national parks across the country: Yellowstone, Yosemite, Great Smoky Mountains, Big Bend. All were last seen wearing headsets. Emergency services said the distress calls were on a frequency that didn't officially exist. But Evelyn knew better. She knew the truth. They'd followed the broadcast. They'd listened, just like she had. She tried to leave the country, tried to cut herself off from all transmissions. But in a gas station in rural Arizona, the clerk turned on a weather radio. Static filled the air, and her voice came through again. They're in the signal. You can't outrun the airwaves. You're the final witness. She ran. Back in Echo Ridge, the site of the original cabin, Evelyn did the only thing she thought might close the story. She hiked into the dead zone where radios crackled, compasses spun, and birds refused to land. There in the center was Cabin 12, no longer ruined. It stood perfectly rebuilt, lanterns lit, door open. Inside a chair, a reel-to-reel deck, and a mirror. On the tape was her name. On the mirror was a message written in condensation: complete the broadcast. She sat down. She didn't remember pressing record, but she spoke. She told it all, everything. And when she finished, the cabin vanished. Ashes in the wind. No one saw Evelyn again. But her voice kept traveling through emergency broadcasts, through ranger radios, through Reddit posts tagged true scary stories, through Let's Read podcasts playing in cars on lonely highways. And if you tune in to 1470 AM near any old national park, you'll hear it too. Not just her story, but the others now looping, layering, becoming one voice, yours. Because now you've listened. Now you're part of the story, and now it's your turn to tell it, to let the next one hear. And when you do, they'll answer. From beneath, from beyond, from the fire in the signal.